The freezing air howled through the gaping hole where the plexiglass nose assembly of the B-17 Flying Fortress, ye old pub dash, used to be. It wasn't just cold. It was the Arctic vacuum of death, sucking the warmth, the soundproofing, and the life out of the remaining crew members. Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brown, piloting the stricken bomber, could barely feel his gloved hands gripping the frozen yoke, his oxygen mask long since shredded or discarded. Only minutes earlier, they had successfully dumped their payload over the heavily fortified industrial targets of Bremen. But the ensuing gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire and the relentless swarm of Luftwaffe fighters had turned their mission into a catastrophic failure of survival. The flak bursts had been brutal, precise, tearing through the fuselage like massive, invisible claws. Then the fighters came, hitting the bomber from every angle. The tail gunner, Private Ivan Moore, was dead, his compartment a bloody mess. The radio operator, S/Sergeant Lloyd Jennings, was critically wounded. Every gun on the right side of the aircraft was inoperable, either jammed or manned by a casualty. 2 of the 4 engines, the number 2 and number 3, were sputtering violently, running rough on critically damaged oil lines, threatening to seize at any moment. The electrical system was almost entirely dead, making communication impossible, and the hydraulic lines were severed, leaving Brown with only manual control over the elevator and rudder, requiring an impossible amount of physical force to keep the heavy bird level. Brown looked down at his altimeter, which was fluctuating wildly but seemed to indicate they were hovering barely above 10,000 feet. Far too low for safety, far too low for the enemy to lose interest, and dangerously close to the deadly German ground batteries. He knew the statistical reality. No B-17 had ever survived this level of damage and made it back across the channel. He was deep within enemy territory, bleeding fuel and losing altitude, piloting what was effectively a flying coffin. The sheer, overwhelming silence from the intercom, broken only by the moan of the protesting metal framework and the rattling of the crippled engines, spoke volumes about the fate of his 9-man crew. Brown, a young man from Weston, West Virginia, felt a profound, ice-cold certainty settle in his stomach. This was where they were going to die, thousands of feet above a land consumed by a war that cared nothing for chivalry or mercy. He pushed the controls forward, fighting the air density and the inherent drag caused by the hundreds of bullet holes peppering the airframe, attempting to nurse every possible mile out of the few remaining functional components, knowing that even if they escaped the Luftwaffe, the frigid North Sea lay ahead, promising hypothermia and drowning. This was not heroism. This was just raw, animal tenacity against impossible odds, fighting gravity and destiny simultaneously. He glanced out the shattered cockpit window and saw nothing but the vast, hostile gray of the German winter sky, waiting for the final, inevitable shadow to fall across his aircraft. The immediate aftermath of the sustained attack had rendered the ye old pub a barely coherent collection of pressurized airframes and mangled wiring. Brown didn't just have to fly the plane, he had to wrestle with it, minute by excruciating minute. The number 2 engine, which had been hit worst, was vibrating so violently that Brown feared it might tear itself completely off the wing, taking the fuel tank with it. He tried to feather the propeller, but the electrical failure prevented the sequence from completing properly, leaving the propeller windmilling erratically, creating immense drag that pulled the nose constantly to the left. The exposed nose compartment, once the domain of the bombardier, now functioned as a gigantic wind scoop, accelerating the already near-fatal drop in cabin temperature and causing the remaining crew members still conscious in the forward fuselage to suffer immediate, severe frostbite. Brown realized the entire oxygen system was gone. The complexity of the delivery network, combined with the explosive decompression, meant that any attempt to climb to a safe altitude would result in immediate anoxia for the survivors. They were forced to stay low, exposed, and vulnerable. Staff Sergeant Jennings, though grievously wounded, managed a heroic crawl back to the flight deck, his face pale and gray. He confirmed the grim tally. 4 crewmen were wounded, 1 was dead, and another was unaccounted for, likely sucked out during the explosive decompression. Brown had sustained superficial wounds himself. Shrapnel peppered his right leg, but the adrenaline had long since numbed the pain. His primary struggle was the manual effort required to move the control surfaces. Without hydraulic boost, Maneuvering the heavy control cables of a B-17 felt like trying to lift a car. Every slight correction, every tiny adjustment to counteract the drag of the ruined wing, demanded a full-body exertion. He was sweating despite the deep freeze, his muscles screaming in protest. The instruments were useless, the compass spun uselessly, and the airspeed indicator was frozen. They were navigating purely by instinct, the sun's position, and the faint, recurring hope of spotting the coast through the hazy winter air. Brown, forcing himself to check the remaining ordnance, found that, incredibly, the ball turret gunner, though injured, had managed to climb back inside. He looked back towards the tail section, seeing the shredded aluminum skin flapping like ribbons. The sheer miracle wasn't that they were still flying, but that the structural integrity of the wing spars hadn't failed yet under the immense stress. They were a ghost ship, a shattered remnant clinging precariously to the sky, and Brown knew it was only a matter of time before they either ran out of fuel, froze solid, or attracted the attention of another, less merciful German fighter squadron eager to finish the job. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in a bustling Luftwaffe operations room, Major Franz Stigler was being debriefed after a frantic morning of intercepting the inbound bomber stream. Stigler was an ace of renown, a veteran of the North African and European campaigns, and a man deeply steeped in the code of honor prevalent among the older generation of fighter pilots. He had 27 confirmed victories, placing him tantalizingly close to the prestigious Knight's Cross. However, his current situation was precarious. His Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 was badly damaged, having taken hits during a close-quarters dogfight with an American P-47 Thunderbolt, forcing him to land to rearm and refuel. He was exhausted, frustrated, and running on fumes of adrenaline, but the pressure to return to the fray was enormous. The American raids were relentless, and every German pilot was critical to the defense of the Reich. As he climbed back into the cockpit, ready for his third sortie of the day, his commanding officer, Major Johannes Steinhoff, pulled him aside and issued a sober warning, one that resonated deeply with Stigler's ingrained sense of flying tradition. "You are Lufthansa pilots first, fighter pilots second. If I ever hear of you shooting at a man who is parachuting or firing on a hopelessly disabled aircraft, I will personally shoot you myself." Steinhoff's words were a stark reminder of the ethical lines drawn even in total war, a line rooted in the shared reverence for the airman's craft. Stigler took off, his mission simple: find stragglers, exploit their weakness, and achieve his 28th kill. He headed west, scanning the gray underbelly of the clouds. After 40 minutes of fruitless searching, his fuel gauges dipped into the critical yellow zone. He was about to break off and head home when he spotted a smear of black smoke against the pale horizon. As he closed in, the smoke coalesced into the unmistakable, monumental silhouette of a B-17. Stigler's heart pounded, realizing this was his opportunity. But as he drew nearer, the expected thrill of the hunt turned into nauseating disbelief. This wasn't a damaged bomber. This was a ghost. It was moving too slowly, too low, and the sheer extent of the destruction was staggering, defying belief that it could remain airborne. He saw the gaping maw where the nose should be, the flayed fuselage, and the unnatural angle of the engine nacelles. He prepared to engage, lining up his gun sight, but something arrested his hand. This wasn't combat. This was an execution. He lowered his nose slightly, reducing his speed to examine the prey before he struck, wanting to ensure he hit a vital spot cleanly. But what he saw next changed everything about his calculus for that day. Franz Stigler edged his Messerschmitt closer, slowing his potent fighter down until he was barely above stalling speed, matching the lumbering pace of the crippled bomber. He flew along the right wingtip, close enough to clearly read the faded designation, "Ye Old Pub," painted near the mangled waist. What he witnessed through the shattered windows horrified him. The cockpit was clearly visible through the torn aluminum. He saw the pilot, Charlie Brown, hunched over the controls, covered in a mixture of oil and blood, struggling visibly to keep the wings level. Stigler looked past Brown and saw the waist gun compartment. One gunner slumped over his weapon, clearly dead, his blood frozen to the cold metal deck. Another crewman was huddled in the corner, tending to a badly wounded comrade, using what looked like torn parachute silk for bandages. The scene wasn't one of defiant combat readiness. It was a scene of triage and desperation, a floating hospital ship on the verge of sinking. Stigler circled wide and then approached the bomber from the left side, bringing his canopy almost alongside the gaping hole in the B-17's nose. He could literally look into the heart of the bomber. He saw the bombardier's seat empty, the floor covered in ice and debris, and then he saw Brown again less than 50 feet away. Their eyes locked across the chasm of war, a fleeting, intense moment of recognition between two men, one poised to deliver death, the other awaiting it. Brown's face was etched with exhaustion and terror, but beneath the fear, Stigler saw an undeniable flicker of determination, a refusal to surrender the ghost ship he commanded. Stigler, a Catholic man whose life had always been guided by a strict adherence to personal honor, found the sight intolerable. He knew that one burst of fire, a short, 6-second blast, from his formidable cannons would obliterate the plane instantly. It was an easy kill, a guaranteed mark toward the Knight's Cross. But looking into Brown's eyes, Stigler didn't see the enemy propaganda figure. He saw a fellow pilot, a fellow human being who, through sheer luck and incredible tenacity, had survived an ordeal that should have killed him hours ago. To kill him now, when he was helpless, wounded, and fighting only to survive, felt not like a military necessity, but a betrayal of the unwritten code of the air, the sacred brotherhood of flyers that transcended national loyalties. The memory of Major Steinhoff's threat, "I will personally shoot you myself," echoed not as a fear of consequence, but as a validation of his own deep moral revulsion. This man had earned the right to live, not by defeating Stigler, but by surviving the inferno of Bremen. The moment of decision stretched into an eternity, hanging heavy in the freezing German air. The German pilot, Major Franz Stigler, felt the weight of his entire military career and his deeply held moral compass pressing down on the control stick. He had been trained to kill. That was the purpose of the Messerschmitt, the raison d'etre of the Luftwaffe fighter corps. The war raged, the fatherland was under siege, and his duty was unequivocally clear: eliminate the enemy threat. Yet this B-17, this pathetic, crippled beast, was no threat. It was a victim. Stigler's internal monologue was a furious argument between the demands of the state and the demands of honor. He had witnessed countless brutal air battles, but always with the clear understanding of a fair fight. What possible glory could be derived from murdering wounded men attempting to fly a broken aircraft over 400 miles of enemy territory? His mind raced back to his early flying days, before the war truly consumed everything, when pilots respected their opponents, often waving to each other before engaging. He remembered the stories of World War I, where chivalry dictated that you didn't fire on a pilot struggling with a burning engine. While the scale of World War II had eroded much of that tradition, Stigler had clung fiercely to the belief that the uniform did not strip a man of his basic humanity. He realized that if he killed Brown now, it wouldn't be a victory. It would be a stain on his soul he would carry forever. He decided. The target was spared, but survival was still far from assured. Stigler had to ensure the bomber made it out of German airspace. The immediate danger wasn't just him, but the numerous anti-aircraft batteries and eager young German pilots patrolling the heavily defended coast, who would see the B-17 as easy prey and wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger. If Stigler simply flew away, the bomber would be shot down within minutes. This realization led him to an even more dangerous, unbelievable decision. He would escort them. He adjusted his position, flying incredibly close formation with the B-17's left wing, a massive, unexpected guardian shadow. He throttled back, forcing his high-performance fighter to match the precarious, slow speed of the B-17, an incredibly difficult feat of airmanship. Brown, inside the cockpit, must have been paralyzed with fear, unable to comprehend why the deadly gray fighter was now flying alongside them, instead of attacking. Stigler dipped his wings, a universal sign of peace and recognition among pilots, signaling his intention for the bomber to fly east, away from the heavily fortified areas, toward the North Sea coast and the relative safety of neutral Sweden. But would Brown understand? Would he trust a move so bizarre, so completely outside the realm of expected wartime brutality? Stigler held his breath, waiting for the American pilot's response, committing himself fully to an act of insubordination that, if discovered by his commanders, would likely result in his immediate execution for treason. This is the crux of the story, isn't it? The moment a soldier chooses humanity over duty, knowing the immense personal risk involved. Given the weight of Franz Stigler's decision, risking his life and honor for a man he had never met, how would you have behaved in that cockpit, having the power to end the conflict instantly, but choosing instead to uphold a moral code that the war itself had tried to extinguish? Share your thoughts on that impossible ethical dilemma in the comments below. Brown saw the movement, the sleek, intimidating Messerschmitt 109, a machine designed for pure, swift destruction, now flying wingtip to wingtip with his shattered bomber. The initial terror was blinding, a primal scream trapped in his throat. This wasn't combat. This was calculated torture. He waited for the cannon burst, the shattering impact of 20mm rounds, but they never came. Instead, the German pilot, whose face was clearly visible behind the Messerschmitt's canopy glass, made gestures that Brown could not immediately decipher. The German pointed repeatedly down and away, towards the northwest, then back at the B-17's ravaged airframe. Brown's mind, operating on pure survival instinct, began to process the unthinkable. This man was trying to communicate. Stigler repeated the wing dip, then flew a short distance ahead and back, confirming the direction. Brown, having no fuel, no defenses, and no other options, instinctively banked the ye olde pub slightly to the north, steering towards the vague, gray line of the North Sea coastline. Stigler immediately adopted a precise escort position on the B-17's left wing, maintaining agonizingly slow speed. This deliberate slowness put immense strain on the Messerschmitt, designed for speed and altitude, not for cruising at 130 knots just above the treetops, but Stigler held the position with expert precision. The next 20 minutes were arguably the most bizarre, terrifying, and profound 20 minutes of Charlie Brown's life. The two aircraft, representatives of mortal enemy forces, flew together, unified only by the German pilot's incredible, unspoken act of mercy. They passed over German coastal towns and military installations. On two separate occasions, the B-17, flying so low and wounded, attracted the attention of German flak gunners on the ground. Brown saw the muzzle flashes begin, the deadly smoke puffs of the anti-aircraft guns appearing near the horizon. But just as the flak batteries prepared to open fire, Stigler violently swung his Bf-109 in front of the bomber, placing his own aircraft directly in the line of fire. He knew the gunners would hesitate before firing on one of their own top-tier fighters. He was using his own life and aircraft as a shield for the enemy. Stigler flew so close, he could smell the oil and burnt metal coming off the B-17's engines. He could see the exhaustion in Brown's face. He knew he had to guide them past the heavy concentration of air defenses near the port city of Wilhelmshaven, a known hornet's nest of Luftwaffe activity. He was actively committing treason to ensure the survival of his enemies, driven by a code that demanded respect for a vanquished, honorable opponent, a deeply personal moral contract that superseded the destructive political demands of the war. The journey lasted nearly half an hour, crossing the heavily fortified zone near the German-Danish border. Stigler was playing a deadly game of misdirection, repeatedly flying slightly ahead, ensuring that ground forces and any passing German pilots would assume he was an escort ordered by high command to shepherd the wreck to a nearby Luftwaffe airbase for intelligence extraction. He maintained perfect, unnerving silence, focusing only on the slow, deliberate flying. Brown, having abandoned all expectation of survival, began to settle into a stunned acceptance. He was flying directly towards the coast, watching the coastline finally transition into the vast, turbulent gray of the North Sea. He risked a subtle wave, a gesture of profound gratitude and confusion, but Stigler offered no direct acknowledgement, maintaining his professional, protective posture. Stigler knew this was his critical juncture. If he crossed the coastline, he risked being spotted by RAF or American patrols, who would certainly shoot down the Messerschmitt without hesitation, seeing a golden opportunity. Furthermore, Crossing the boundary into international waters on such an unauthorized mission would be undeniable proof of treason if he were ever captured or forced to explain his actions. As the ye olde pub cleared the final sandy stretches of the German coast, entering the airspace above the icy North Sea, Stigler brought his fighter to a final position directly off Brown's left wing. He held the position for a long, silent moment, a final, intense connection. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he brought the Messerschmitt into a smooth, 180-degree turn, turning back toward the German interior. As he pulled away, he offered one last, powerful salute. A sharp snap of the wrist, a gesture of respect from one pilot to another. Then he sped away, vanishing back into the gray European sky, leaving Brown and his battered crew alone to face the treacherous 400 miles over the icy waters of the North Sea towards the safety of England or Scotland. Inside the B-17, the remaining crew members, who had watched the entire impossible escort in stunned silence, finally began to breathe again. There were tears and low murmurs of disbelief. They had been spared not by luck, but by the conscious, defiant choice of an enemy ace. Their survival now depended on Brown nursing the broken engines and the rapidly dropping fuel reserves across the vast expanse of water. The cold was still debilitating. The plane was still barely holding together, but the immediate threat of annihilation had been replaced by the difficult, cold reality of navigation and endurance. Brown looked out at the spot where the German fighter had been, feeling an overwhelming wave of exhaustion and gratitude. He had encountered a miracle, a demonstration of humanity so profound it seemed impossible it could exist in the savagery of total war. Franz Stigler's return journey was perhaps more dangerous than the mission itself. He flew low and fast back to his base, his mind racing, constructing the narrative he would have to tell. He landed, his Bf-109 barely having enough fuel left to taxi to the dispersal point. When debriefed, he reported that he had indeed found a crippled B-17, but due to heavy cloud cover and his own aircraft's critical shortage of ammunition, a lie he had to maintain, he was unable to finish the job and had simply watched the bomber crash into the sea. This report, while incomplete, was plausible and aligned with the expectations that any B-17 in that condition would inevitably fall. He did not claim the kill, meaning his Knight's Cross remained out of reach, but he maintained the secret of his act, protecting himself from the charge of treason. Any deviation from the party line could result in a court-martial and death. He carried the weight of the secret, the image of Charlie Brown's face etched permanently in his memory, a silent pact shared across enemy lines. Meanwhile, in England, Charlie Brown managed an astonishing feat of airmanship, navigating the ye olde pub across the North Sea on 2 sputtering engines and minimal controls. They finally landed, skidding violently on the runway at Seething Airfield in Norfolk, the plane utterly destroyed but the crew largely intact. When Brown was debriefed by intelligence officers, he faced a similar, though less fatal, dilemma. He was asked to recount every detail of the flight, especially the final stages. When he described the German pilot, the escort, and the final salute, the intelligence officers reacted with immediate, skeptical hostility. They couldn't reconcile the existence of such chivalry with the relentless brutality of the enemy they fought. They suggested it was a trick, a calculated effort to lure other Allied aircraft into a trap. More importantly, they feared that if the story of a merciful German pilot spread, it would demoralize the American bomber crews, fostering a dangerous sense of complacency or sympathy for the enemy. Brown was explicitly ordered by his commanding officers not to speak of the incident again, warning him that divulging the information was a matter of national security and could compromise the morale of the entire 8th Air Force. The story was classified, buried in thick folders marked Top Secret. Both pilots, separated by hundreds of miles and the raging conflict, were bound by a shared secret, an act of profound humanity that had to be erased from the official record of the war for the sake of political and military expediency. The war had nearly killed them both, but it was the silence afterward that threatened to haunt them. For the next 4 decades, the incident remained a closed chapter, a haunting memory Charlie Brown carried with him through the end of the war, his post-war civilian life, and his eventual career with the U.S. State Department. The physical damage healed, but the image of the German pilot's face, etched with something other than malice, never faded. He occasionally mentioned the event to close family or trusted friends, but the story was often met with disbelief or categorized as wartime delirium. The classification of the report meant that officially, the German pilot did not exist. For Brown, the question wasn't just why he was spared, but who had spared him. He felt an intense, lifelong need to find this man, to thank him, and to validate the most unbelievable moment of his wartime experience. He often searched records, wrote letters to veterans organizations, and pored over lists of Luftwaffe aces, but the trail was always cold. Franz Stigler, meanwhile, survived the war, though he suffered immense hardships in the post-war chaos and poverty of Germany. He eventually emigrated to Canada, where he started a small construction business in Vancouver. The memory of the B-17, the crippled bomber, and the eyes of the young American pilot were his constant companions. He never told anyone the full story, fearing that even decades later, the admission of saving an enemy aircrew might bring consequences from resentful veterans or stain his reputation among his peers. He lived a modest, quiet life, but the secret weighed heavily. He sometimes wondered what happened to the flying coffin and its pilot, hoping they had made it to safety, but having no way to confirm. As the years turned into decades, the chance of finding the German pilot seemed impossibly small. The official records of the Luftwaffe were patchy, and the vastness of post-war migration made individual tracing nearly impossible. It was only in the late 1980s, driven by an intensified curiosity and the approaching reality of mortality, that Charlie Brown dedicated himself completely to solving the 40-year-old mystery. He began contacting veteran groups on both sides of the Atlantic, utilizing the nascent power of international computer networks and historical research archives. He knew the location, the date, and the type of German aircraft, a Messerschmitt 109, and he knew the name of his bomber, Ye Olde Pubdash. These were the only concrete clues he possessed, but he pursued them with a quiet, burning determination that had saved his life that fateful day in 1943. He finally reached out to the Luftwaffe Fighter Pilots Association submitting a detailed inquiry about a German ace who might have been flying in the Bremen area on December 20th, 1943, and who had failed to claim a confirmed victory that day. The breakthrough finally came in 1990. Charlie Brown's persistent inquiries, routed through a complex network of historians and veteran organizations, eventually reached the desk of a retired Luftwaffe colonel. The colonel, intrigued by the specific details and the emotional plea, decided to publish a small article in a German fighter pilot's newsletter asking if any veteran recalled the peculiar incident of a severely damaged B-17 that day. In Vancouver, Canada, Franz Stigler, now 75 years old, received the newsletter. He recognized the date instantly, December 20th, 1943. He recognized the location, Bremen. And then he saw the name of the B-17, Ye Olde Pubdash. The floodgates of 47 years of suppressed memory burst open. The details matched his own carefully guarded secret perfectly. He read the article several times, shaking with emotion. He finally had confirmation that the men he had saved had made it home. Stigler responded immediately, confirming that he was indeed the pilot, and provided details only the escorting pilot could have known. The number of holes in the nose, the specific type of engine damage, and the precise moment of the final salute over the North Sea. The organizers quickly connected the two men. Brown immediately called Stigler in Canada. The phone conversation was tense, emotional, and filled with 40 years of unspoken gratitude. Brown didn't start with formalities. He started with the moment their eyes met. "My name is Charlie Brown," he said. "I was the pilot of the B-17 you escorted out over the sea." Stigler simply responded, his voice thick with emotion, "I know. I was the one who let you go. I couldn't shoot at those guys. It was like they were parachuting. I had to get you out." The shared validation was immense. They weren't strangers talking about history. They were participants in a shared, impossible moment of human connection forged in the crucible of war. They immediately arranged a meeting. The two veterans, one American, one German, who should have been mortal enemies, were finally going to meet face to face, not through the shattered canopy of a bomber and the sight of a fighter, but as men seeking peace and closure. The anticipation for their meeting was huge. representing the ultimate triumph of human kindness over the mechanized horror of global conflict. Brown boarded a plane, flying west, finally closing the loop on the question that had defined his adult life. Who was the man who chose honor over the kill, and what motivated that singular, magnificent deviation from the rules of war that defined their entire generation? He was about to find his wartime savior, his accidental friend, and the keeper of his most incredible secret,